very rapid shift, from skeptic to patient to advocate. And it's something that's unique and really powerful. And I think, when you get a bunch of people together, they can do really great things and they can really impact each other positively.
Absolutely. So there's been a lot of issues with legalization. So let's get this out of the way. Yay, it's legal. That is huge, actually. So great. That's awesome. Things that are legalized are often regulated and more than often over-regulated. And particularly cannabis seems to be sort of bearing the brunt of mistakes that have been made in other industries, while also seemingly forcing this industry to kind of make those same mistakes. We talked a little bit about equality. You mentioned, what is your take on what's been happening in the industry? Have you noticed a major shift in terms of a gender gap?
That's an interesting question. I think that I'm really fortunate to be so focused on patients that I don't spend a lot of time looking at the broader industry in terms of some of those systemic issues. I think that things are getting better. I think that it's about people feeling comfortable and feeling confident, and that comes from having peer support. So whether you're looking to work in the industry or you're just a consumer in the industry, I think that, having people out there that validate your experience is really what affirms, what you feel you can and cannot do. And, when it comes to cannabis, that's just about saying, hey, as my dear friend and SheCann CCO, Irie Selker says, do what you love and put a little weed on it. So that's the advice I have often, especially to women who are concerned about there being a gender imbalance is, the best thing you can do is focus on what your strengths are, find people who are going to be your cheerleaders and who are also going to be honest with you, and do what you love and put a little weed on it. So whatever your strength is, whether it's communication, whether it's advertising, whether it's creativity, whether it's development, that needs to be your focus. And are there going to be challenges? Absolutely. But you get to decide, what army you have behind you to support you, in navigating those. So I think for myself, I've been very fortunate. I mean, I have so many people, so many women, especially that I look to, for that guidance and for that reassurance. And now I take pride in being able to, to do that for other women as well. And I feel I have a responsibility to show them that there's so many opportunities, to wade through a lot of the issues that plague this industry.
Yeah, absolutely. There are. And I'm a historical nerd, right? And so I love sociological trends and historical facts and watching the way society has shifted around cannabis in my lifetime and through books all the way back to the Middle Ages. It's something that's very kind of hard for me to ignore. At the same time, in my own personal circle and in my own experience, it hasn't really been an issue. I always kind of think just focus on the work. And if you believe the work that you're doing is important and you believe in the work that you're doing, then just focus on that and everything else kind of comes by the wayside. I do think, unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily help everybody. That's not necessarily good advice for everybody. And so it's difficult because, as you mentioned in the beginning of your response, it's systemic. And some of these systemic issues are what trickles down. So it ends up relating to things like taxes. It ends up relating to higher costs, steeper regulations, the stigma as well that you mentioned. Another example is sort of the clamping down on, again, this is for other reasons, but not legalizing sort of consumption spaces where people can gather together inside out of the Canadian winter and consume cannabis. That is entirely stigma related and makes zero sense when you compare it to alcohol. How do you think that we can get consumption lounges throughout Canada?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'm going to ask Google. I think Google will know the answer. I'll just Google it. I think that comes from the most powerful voice in this industry, whether we know it or not, is the consumer. The regulations have completely paralyzed so many players in this industry. So, whether it be licensed producers, whether it be, dispensary owners, whether it be the makers or the clinics, they don't have a lot of opportunity to be the voice of change because they are so heavily hampered. And I think the one constant across medical, across adult use, is that as a consumer, you are holding the most power because you have the opportunities to speak freely. So when it comes to consumption lounges, I think that the way that that's going to move is by the same way that everything in this industry, has shifted, which is one person's story, one person's experience becoming something that creates a movement of advocacy. So if people, I don't know necessarily that people are aware of just how limiting the lack of consumption lounges is going to be, just how much it hinders them, and just how much they're being stigmatized by it. So I think almost we have to bring awareness to the issue. We have to bring awareness to consumers and say, hey, is this something you want? And if you want it, then you need to have a voice that mobilizes this so you can take it to your municipal politicians, you can take it to your provincial governments, and you can educate them and really point out that, consumers are buying the products, they're paying the taxes, and consumers are also voting. So they really hold the most power. And I think they're largely unaware of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is, we're in the United States, John F. Kennedy in particular started talking about consumer power and consumer rights, and started touting certain consumer advocacy groups. And since that time, the United States has gotten very, very powerful consumer groups. People like Ralph Nader have made an entire career out of representing consumer organizations. And that has been lacking in Canada, partially because we didn't have JFK, partially because we were founded by the Hudson's Bay Company. So none of these regulations have taken patients into mind. They haven't really taken logistics around the product itself in mind. They haven't taken their advice from other industries in mind. So there's been a lot of issues around that by itself. And this is made more difficult, I think, because we've got consumer education issues where you have pockets like Vancouver and Victoria and certain communities in Toronto and Montreal and certain communities online that actually do have a lot of knowledge and can share a lot of that knowledge. But you've also got a lot of people whose doctor told them about cannabis, signed them up for Organigram because they heard that was a good one, or CannTrust. And when there was a problem, they just move it to another one, and they don't know anything about these producers. They don't know anything about cannabis, and neither do the consumers. So I think that's a really strong missing link as well.
I completely agree with you. And I will go on record as saying, probably for the first time publicly, that the industry and the country needs a strong formal consumer lobby at this point. That is what we are lacking. That is what we are missing. And I believe that is the all-encompassing answer to so many of the issues. Everything from access for medical patients to consumption lounges, to amnesty. At the end of the day, those issues all do feed back to the consumer. And I think that we actually have far more allies in industry as consumers that will support a lobby, because a lot of the issues are the same. The issues facing licensed producers when it comes to packaging. A lot of consumers assume that this is something that comes as a result of licensed producers wanting to do it this way. And as you said, they aren't aware of the mechanics of such. They don't understand where the regulations come from. They don't even understand what the regulations mandate and just how they influence, how much waste goes into packaging their product by the time they get it. And I think that it is high time, no pun intended, that we have a robust consumer lobby in the cannabis space in Canada that really is a voice for change and reform that can exert pressure on the industry, but also on the regulator. Most importantly, on the regulators. They need to hear a concerted voice. They need to hear, an informed voice. And a consumer lobby also serves to educate all those people and all those consumers and stakeholders who really aren't aware of the issues. And, there's pockets of that happening, but I think legalization has given us an opportunity to really unite all of those interests under one umbrella.
Well, and I think it has to. I mean, this is something that I've been sort of advocating for a little while. And it's hard to kind of pitch in an industry that's seen a plethora of associations and advocacy organizations, but none of them have actually focused on the consumer, not a single one. And so that is missing. In terms of what legalization has done to the activist crowd, I find it's really kind of split it a bunch where you've got people that maybe said, you know what, I'm going to try and make change from inside, and then ended up in places where they couldn't. You've got other people that are kind of coming along going, okay, well, I can actually make change from the inside. You've got other people that are still pushing on the outside, like, certain dispensaries that are still saying, look, you still don't serve our patients. We've been serving these patients for decades, and this system would not allow us to serve these people, and there's nothing left for them. There's nowhere else that can pick that up. And so I think it's been interesting to kind of watch how, particularly on the medical side, there doesn't really seem to be the same strong organizations that there used to be. There's CFAM that's focused on the taxes, and there's Cannabis Amnesty, which is focused on pardons, and I'm hoping expungements is part of their plan as well, because full expungements are actually needed to allow everyone into the industry that wants to get into the industry the way that it is right now. So, I mean, I think that's important to kind of consider as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I'm kind of a sucker for an all-encompassing powerhouse at this point. Like, I think that a lot of these groups, people admire them from afar, or they want to support them, but they don't know how to. And the fact is that advocacy is thankless work, and it's exhausting, and it doesn't pay, and there isn't a lot of funding behind it. And that's the problem. And so a robust consumer lobby has a different approach, because we're not just talking about poor patients or, groups that have been marginalized and largely punished under a previous system of prohibition. When we're talking about consumers, we're talking about everybody who gets to vote with their wallet. And there is a whole lot of reason to invest in something that looks like that. And as you said, I mean, the US has done lobbying in ways for consumers that, we've never successfully replicated. But there are a lot of powerful lobbies in this country, and there is absolutely no reason why cannabis can't use this frustration as an opportunity to unite.
Well, absolutely. And I think it has to, because frankly, most of the industry is happy to have a license. So, Health Canada comes along and says, you can't do that. And maybe some of them go, okay, this is really stupid. We should be doing it this way. And they go, yeah, but you're going to do it this way. And they go, okay, thank you. Right. And I get that, but it doesn't really end up causing a lot of pushback. You can kind of say things over and over again, but as long as you are grateful to kind of have that license. And I think a lot of the newer players, I mean, people kind of forget how many licenses there are now, particularly as the micros come online. There's more of those. I think there's a different attitude coming into it now, where it's the people that did care a little bit more about the product. It's people that have maybe been doing this forever and care a great deal for the product. There are variations of people that can now get into the industry that were formerly gray market or MMAR, but there's still a vast amount of people that are let out. So I think that there's a lot of issues. I think tax and amnesty are both worthy, strong issues, but there's been no one at the end of the day standing up for consumers. No one at all. Some groups have been standing up for medical consumers, but not in terms of people that are going to a retail store and buying a product that is being packaged and stored in a way that is maybe not best for the product. Clearly, there's some QA issues going on with what people have been getting in their products. That should be a major concern. If this was the United States, for all the image that they have of being big corporations and big business, consumer advocacy is also huge and very powerful, because there's a conflict in law. And I was trying to get through a whole episode without getting all like really weird and historical data nerdy. But there was some of the first laws in the world came out of Arabia, Hammurabi's laws, and they kind of said, if a worker did some work on your house under contract and it was kind of crappy work and you got injured somehow, that was that worker's fault. Instead, we kind of have Roman law, which was buyer beware. And so there's been like a shift to try and get towards some sort of like fairness. That's the whole point of regulations with other substances is to try and just make sure that everything is done fairly. No one is profiting off of things that maybe are not beneficial in the long run. And so that concept, I feel, is that needs to change around cannabis. We need to stop going, oh, wow, I can go to my legal store and